So good morning, everyone. Welcome. I think for those of you who got the email, I think you're all aware that we have a pretty exciting session ahead of us today on building measures to take to prepare for reopening. We have three great panelists, and I'll introduce them a little bit later. But just to start, I wanted to go through a little bit of the Seattle 2030 district and who we are. So we're really an organization that is trying to break down market barriers to building efficiency in downtown Seattle and the surrounding neighborhoods. And the reason that we're doing this is because we have some pretty lofty environmental goals that we need to hit over the next 10 years. And buildings are a huge piece of that pie, and if we don't start to address it, then we're really not going to solve the climate crisis that we're in. So like I just said, we're located in downtown Seattle and the surrounding neighborhoods. You can see here from this map that we kind of hit a lot of those. So we go from SoDo, there's no landmarks on this map, but we go pretty much from the Starbucks Center all the way up to Lake Union. You can kind of see on the lake where we go, and then from the waterfront all the way up to Capitol Hill and First Hill. We have an MOU with the Capitol Hill Eco District, so the Capitol Hill boundary is a little bit larger than that, but just for ease of representation on the map, that's what it looks like. We have 260 member buildings committed to the district goals right now. That's made up of around about 140 members, and that equals just under 60 million square feet. And then just to touch on what the goals are. So we're working towards a 50% reduction in energy, water, and transportation emissions by the year 2030. And that's a district-wide goal. So we're asking building owners to work towards it. But because it's an average goal that we're all working towards, then some buildings will be able to go above that 50% goal. So if you're a newer building, hopefully you're kind of more towards that 70, 80% reduction from CBEX 2003. And if you're an older building, maybe you can only hit 20 to 30. But on average, we're all going to hit that 50% goal. And that then puts us on a path to climate stabilization by the year 2030. And then maybe we start to work towards net zero or carbon neutral by the year 2050. One last thing that I did want to highlight here, we just released our 2020 progress report a few months ago. It has quite a lot of information in there. This is the first report that we've done since about 2016. So it has a lot of updates of what we've been doing over the last 4 years, what programs we've been working on, the progress that we're making towards the goals. And then also there's a piece in there of what we see the next things that are coming down the line. What are the important steps that need to be taken from us as the commercial real estate industry to really work towards those 2030 goals. And then you saw the slide at the beginning. I really do want to thank our district annual sponsorships. Now more than ever, their sponsorship becomes more important given the financial situation that we're currently in and working towards with the economy. So without their support, we really wouldn't be able to put sessions like this on and do the work that we do. And then that also goes for our district funders. So Boeing, the Bullitt Foundation in King County, without their support, we really wouldn't be able to do a lot of the great work that we do around stormwater, energy, and transportation. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers. I'm just going to highlight the fact that the three of these are very distinguished people in their field, and we really wanted to try and get a mix of different stakeholders for this meeting. So we have Dan Pollino, who's an energy operations manager for CBRE, who's coming in with that kind of building management experience and point of view. We have Kelly Griffin, who is the workplace strategy director from NBBJ, coming at it obviously from the architectural point of view. And then Michael Frank is the vice president of design and engineering, not with CBRE. That's a mistake on my part. Michael is with McKinstry, and he's going to be talking about the engineering side of things. So with that, I'm actually going to ask all three of the panelists to introduce themselves, just because I think that's a little bit easier. So I'm going to start with Dan.
Morning, everybody. My name is Dan. I work with CBRE. I'm an engineering operations manager. I've been working with CBRE for several years. I've been in Seattle for the last 5. I was 27 years before that in San Diego, but we're super fortunate to be here in the Pacific Northwest. Just absolutely love it. So recently just got my certified energy management certificate from Associates of Energy Engineering. And we're really working, CBRE has definite goals and commitments for energy efficiency looking now and also in the future.
Thanks, Dan. Kelly, why don't you go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Griffin. I'm with NBBJ. I'm looking at 21 years with NBBJ starting next month, so it's been a while. I grew up as an architect and a designer, but one of the things I've done over the last probably 6 or 7 years is take over our workplace strategy efforts. And what that means is that we get to engage with clients early on in the process, even before maybe a building has been selected, and help align a workplace with their strategic, operational, cultural goals, the things that they're trying to accomplish as an organization. And I think one of the things we're starting to see a lot more urgency around is not only setting up, what is the right work environment, what's the right set of amenities, but how do we show up as a partner in battling climate change? And so I think that's a conversation that a lot more of our colleagues are interested in. And again, getting to start off early in the process before even the program is set means we can start to set some of those goals and ideas early on and make sure they show up in the final result.
Thank you, Kelly. And Michael, why don't you go next?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So yeah, Michael Frank with McKinstry, similar boat as Kelly. This is my 20th year with McKinstry, and yeah, kind of worked my way up through the engineering group, started right out of school, had a serious bent for sustainability in school, and was able to find an organization where I could just work on that throughout my entire career. So I now lead our engineering operations around the country, and yeah, where we focus on almost every vertical and type of building, and work with all sorts of customers, and I'm afforded the unique opportunity to see most of those different ideas and designs come across my desk. So I get to help shape those and also learn from all of the amazing things that our engineering and design team is doing across the country. So thanks for having me.
All right, thanks everyone. So just so everyone who is on the call knows, I think all 3 of these companies were founding members of the 2030 district. So I think some were involved in conversations as far back as 2009. Just because everyone else did it, I think I'm coming up on 10 years with the 2030 district, so it's going to be a huge celebration for that, I'm sure. So we're going to do this a little bit different than the last session we did. For those of you who are on the call, we did a little bit more of a presentation style. This one is going to be a little bit more of a panel style, just because I think the topic lends itself to that a little bit. So we're going to start with a question for Dan. I just want to know if you have seen a shift in the time of day that work can be done in tenant spaces, with buildings being at this kind of low or no occupancy right now.
There's definitely been a shift in the way that our clients do business, and the whether or not the work that we normally would do during the day would impact their business. So a lot of our work has been shifted toward either a PM shift or an evening shift to get it done when the client is not in the building. And then obviously with everybody out of the building, we've been able to save the owner a considerable amount of money by doing that work during the day. So having contractors come in when contracted work was needed and paying them a normal rate rather than the overtime for after hours. So that's kind of definitely saved some money on that. There are small maintenance projects like painting stairwells and things that we normally wouldn't be able to do because of the traffic in the building. Some buildings had to remove some rock on a patio that was above a sidewalk. So things like that normally wouldn't be able to be done during the day because of the traffic. So we've been able to get done a lot of projects like that. Also in the shift of the way that our client needs us to work in the building is also the way the client uses the building. So normally the fire stairwells were typically not used before because the building occupancy was not as high as it is now. So now the clients use the stairwells much more, and it's much it's more of a thing for people to move between floors rather than take the elevator. So that we have problems with pressurization on some of the floors because of this. So at one of the buildings, we had a project to replace all the closures in the building with a higher force closure that still met ADA requirements. And that couldn't be done during the day because it was impactful to the tenants. So COVID allowed us to do that during the day and get those projects done, a lot of times doing them in-house and saving a considerable amount of money.
Thank you. So Kelly, I'm going to come to you next. I think a lot of the initial reactions to this pandemic suggested that we should probably start to change the physical workplace quite significantly. Kind of thinking about increasing the size of workstations to allow for social distancing or potentially increasing panel heights. Are you seeing people or your clients starting to pursue this direction?
I think it depends. And it's been really interesting because we've been working over the last couple of months with several industries, whether it's legal or tech or gaming or finance and entertainment. Any of those groups are really taking a different tact. And I think first and foremost, it's grounded in kind of the nature of the organization. And I think some of the more conservative organizations are likely to say, we really got to do something about this and react in this moment to some of the fears that are out there. We are working with other organizations that are actually seeing this as a huge opportunity to completely rethink their workplace. So as I said, it kind of varies depending on where the organization is. It's also interesting to think about where they are, if they're occupied in the early design phases or later design phases. I think some of our clients see the fact that they're in the middle of a design process as a strength, that they have the strength of time to let things kind of settle out, to let the information become clearer, because as you all know, we learn something new every week about how we're supposed to behave and what the virus does. And so these companies are taking more of a wait and see attitude. I think a couple of the things, though, I did want to emphasize here with this question is the idea that there's a lot of gains we've made in the workplace over the last decade or so that make them better for human health, right? We used to be, behind solid panels or behind a door, and light was limited and views were limited. And as much as the open environment has caused a lot of reactions, both positive and negative, it did give people access to things they didn't have before. So more daylight, more views, more access to the folks that they work with for better visibility and interaction. And as a result, it concerns me to see the industry say, oh no, let's put really tall panels back up, because then we lose that connection we used to have. Or let's go to the office and sit 6 feet away from each other, when the whole point of conversing and being in the place together is to actually benefit from those micro communications that happen through facial gestures and body gestures. So I think one of the things that we're going to start to see is actually, or we're going to help our clients think about, is behavioral and operational shifts and not physical shifts. And again, some of the immediate reactions of, oh, let's rip out all our workstations and start from scratch. Not only is that expensive, it's really wasteful. And so I think we can get human behavior changing a little bit more productively and obviously more quickly. It's a lot faster to do that potentially than to try to order a whole bunch of new furniture. And I think finally the last point there is that the workstations themselves aren't always the problem. It's the pinch points. And Dan was just alluding to the stair use. Elevators are more of a problem than where I sit at my desk every day. So how do you mitigate that kind of thing? That's where we're starting to see clients think a little bit harder about where there's moments where people sort of funnel together before they go back into the workplace itself.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point. I think we covered a lot of that in our last education session, kind of lessons learned from the construction industry, because obviously there's a lot of them that opened early and we're dealing with a lot of those pinch points. And if you want to see that webinar, it was recorded, so it's on our YouTube page, so you can catch up on all of that great information. So Michael, coming to you, I think Kelly just talked a lot about the design side of things there and the human behavior. In terms of the technology, what are the smart technologies out there that can help owners reopen in a safe manner?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, or I have a very similar response to Kelly. I think there are a lot of things that can be done that, and I'll get into a few of them in a minute here, that maybe are on the conservative side that also cost quite a bit of money. And so, those things are like, would you want to have Bluetooth beacons installed and apps on everyone's cell phone so that you could do contact tracing, things like that, if you don't have the backbone and the system for that installed already, could be quite expensive. But there's some, I like to recommend to our customers trying to use the systems that they have in place to get a little bit more benefit out of them. So ideas like most organizations have security cameras already, right? That could be utilized to at least do people counting to understand the number of occupants in a building if in these first few phases we continue to have limited amounts of people that should be in buildings. I think there's and then you could choose to go to the next step of kind of people counting throughout the space to do contact tracing, like I mentioned, if that was an add-on you chose to do. I think there's some interesting things, especially you mentioned elevators, Kelly, and I totally agree. It's those pinch points. There are some touchless technologies that could be installed for elevators, right? Either using ID badges to get you to the floor that you need to go to so that you don't have to touch any of the surfaces in those elevators, or using cell phone apps to be able to do that sort of thing. I think there are a lot of little things that can add up to behavior changes so that you can get after at least the cleanliness factor and disinfection factor, or not having to do that as much for surfaces in buildings. I couldn't help but think about in elevators, there's a lot of talk about different kind of disinfecting technologies, UV and ionization and that sort of thing. And there's multiple, I don't want to get too geeky, but there's multiple versions of UV lighting, UV A, B, and C, and they decrease in their severity the higher the letter gets. And so UVC is a technology that actually might be able to be utilized or could be utilized in a light, and a lot of manufacturers are integrating them into typical or traditional lighting now, and that could be used in an elevator, right? It's a low level of UV radiation that could be used to disinfect surfaces all the time. So I think there are a lot of little technologies that could be kind of stitched together to help building owners.
Thanks, Michael. It's actually super helpful. I did not know about the UV light one. Keeps things, well, I think in that ever-changing world, it's good to know that there's little things that you can do in a building to help with this, as well as the larger things. So speaking of equipment, just to go back to Dan a little bit, we talked earlier when we first started looking at this session about the potential challenges of using existing equipment to deal with some of these CDC requirements that are also changing quite fluidly. Can you talk to that a little bit and about some of the upgrades that you have made during this time?
Yeah, absolutely. And just because Michael and Kelly talked about it, elevators were a large part of the equipment that we had to consider for reoccupancy. Some of our clients requested a maximum of 4 people per elevator, and they wanted that to be controlled by the elevator. So we had a lot of challenges with that. And with, for example, ThyssenKrupp has destination dispatch, and Otis and all the other manufacturers have similar technology. That was relatively simple to do, where we could limit the amount of destinations that the elevator would go to, but it still doesn't really limit the amount of people. It's still dependent on the people. So a lot of these things, and a lot of these things that we're talking about, are dependent on people. So a lot of it is training, training not only the employees but the tenants to let them know that I mean, even though it only has 4 destinations, if you have 50 people going to the 10th floor, 50 people can crowd in that elevator. So you have to also train them that's something that needs to be done. And then, of course, the elevators that didn't have destination dispatch, just 2-button elevators, how is it possible to limit those by weight? And there were inherent problems with that, with using the weight limit on the car, lowering it down from, say, a 2,000-pound elevator to a 600-pound elevator where you have 450-pound people. But there are so many problems inherent with that, with not everybody's 150 pounds, and the weight limit is used to pick the brakes and pick the motor, so it's not designed to be used as a person limiting thing. So all these things kind of came into play, but elevators were definitely a big part of that. But the CDC's requirement of at least 50% outside air was a large challenge as well, because our buildings aren't designed to. They're designed to have the minimum amount, the ASHRAE 62 ventilation coming into the building, and the more we bring in there, the more heat and humidity we bring in as well that we have to remove. So buildings really aren't designed to that, so that's been a challenge as well. But during this time, we also used the time to upgrade some systems, like all our air conditioning units that were R22, we changed them out to TDX20, which is an HFC. So we increased our efficiency. I think it was by 11%, and we're able to do that in some of the buildings, so that worked out quite well. We finished some upgrades. We use this time also to pitch to some of the owners about, we really didn't have hands-free faucets or hands-free restroom equipment planned until next year or the year after. Now is a perfect time to do it. So we were able to get a lot of those approved and installed in the buildings. Toe pull for the doors to open them up, so you don't have to touch the doors, where we didn't have ADA door openers. So things like that have really helped us prepare and deal with the CDC requirements for reoccupation.
Awesome. That's really great to hear that there's still some opportunities out there to improve efficiency. I think that 11% on your HVAC was a pretty good story for some of this stuff. So we've been through a few questions here. I do want to remind folks who are on the call that they can use the chat function to put some questions in, and we have Anne Enomoto, our communications and engagement manager, kind of monitoring that, and we'll get to it at the end. You could also use the hands-free function as well, just in case you want to call attention to the fact that you want to ask a question. So we're going to go, I've lost my place here, back to Michael after that, just because we were talking a little bit about their kind of what building owners can do and what they are doing in their building. Are you seeing any specific retrofit measures, or do you know of any specific retrofit measures that you'd recommend to save energy and also make buildings safer when they reoccupy?
Yeah, I think Dan probably hit it right on the head. I think there are a lot of data points that suggest that we actually want to, do things like bring in more outside air, run buildings for longer so that we can have, either dual shifts or just spread people out throughout the day. And a lot of those things actually lead to increased energy usage versus decreased energy usage, and you wish it would be different. I think the thing that potentially balances that is, at least in these initial phases, we're not reoccupying our buildings at full capacity, right? So even though if you have an HVAC system, let's say, that has the ability to bring in more outside air, or potentially run it for longer and do flushes before and into the evening, if you're at 40 or 50% capacity, doubling your outside air, if that's a possibility, maybe you end up not having an impact, but being able to create a safer indoor air quality environment. And so I think, similarly, Dan, you touched on there are a lot of smaller things that in terms of water usage that can be implemented in the short term and are great to kind of pick off. But then there's, from an HVAC perspective, I think there's the getting back to basics piece. Once you get after the kind of the sanitation, the social distancing, the cleaning, those types of protocols, and the training your employees about exactly how they should occupy buildings, because it's different than we're used to, then I think it's making sure that the systems that you do have are functioning in the way that they should be functioning, right? Especially existing building systems, depending on their age, making sure that all the dampers that you actually have in the building are functioning properly, that there aren't any that are stuck closed that would prevent you from having proper airflow and the right amount of outside air. So I think it's more about kind of dialing in and retro commissioning or recommissioning your building and taking it through its paces to make sure that it can do what it was designed to do properly, more so than recommending wholesale energy retrofits at this time, because as you mentioned at the beginning of the kind of the webcast here, Matt, it's especially in these interesting economic times, I think a lot of customers, building owners, are hesitant to spend a lot of money doing changes when we're still in a little bit of a wait and see with what happens with the economy. So I think, again, getting back to basics, making sure systems are working properly, and then adjusting them once you know they're working properly so that you can get the most out of them.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Kelly, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here, because I think this was touched upon a couple of times with the outside air side of things. So a bit of a two-part question. So as people start to think about when they should return to the office, what are the things that they should really consider? And also, how do you know when it's the right time to return, and who should return during that time? And then the second part is not hugely related, but because we've talked a little bit about the outside air side of things, there's been a lot of evidence to suggest that more people are more productive when they have that kind of outside air side of things. So I wondered if you could talk to that a little bit as well.
Yeah. So the first half of the question really is about who should come back and why. I think this is a good opportunity for an organization to start thinking about how do they want to show up in the world right now. And we see a range from organizations that say, you know what, this huge experiment of remote working has shown us that our people can do it. And you know what? It's a benefit for them. A lot of people really appreciate the lack of commute, the more focused time, the ability to be around their families more. And so part of the conversation wants to be, how can we achieve our mission and our vision of whatever we're doing for the world, and support our people in a way that help them be as productive as possible? And so I think that conversation has to be sort of fundamental. A lot of people want to rush back to the office because they feel like they should, but I think a lot of organizations are also saying, you know what, we're learning something from this moment right now. Maybe we can wait a little bit. Maybe we can watch how things evolve. We can see how our people are doing and then make some decisions based on that. So again, it's about how do you want to show up as an organization? When people come back, why are they coming back? Are they essential, or are they just dying because their work from home situation isn't conducive to this? or are they really missing the social interactions that they used to have? So I think being really methodical and thoughtful about that helps. And then it starts to answer some of the questions that Michael mentioned, which is how many people are in the office in the first place? And do you even need to do staggered shifts and use more energy to make that happen? So I think that's the first part of the question. And then Matt, to your question about natural ventilation and productivity, I don't know the science off the top of my head, but I do know everything I read says that people are more productive when they have fresh air. And you guys are probably way more expert at this than I am. But I think the thing that really matters is you are more tolerant of temperature and breeze changes when it happens naturally, because it's not a constant force of cold air. And so you're more willing to accept those changes, and you're more comfortable. Speaking, for all the women out there who sit and freeze through the summers when the air conditioning is blasting, I know that we generally feel less productive because we're so cold, we're so worried about trying to stay warm that we can't actually think about it. And there's actually one of the top things we always hear when we do our workplace engagements is it's too noisy and it's too hot or it's too cold. And the fact that that has to be the thing that we're complaining about tells me that there's something that's not quite working with our buildings. And so the natural ventilation tends to kind of offset and mitigate that issue.
Thanks, Kelly.
I think maybe just to add on to that, Matt, if you don't mind, I think it is interesting and could be a fun experiment, especially in kind of this phased return to work. To that point, testing out, I wasn't necessarily thinking about this before, but testing out the idea of either desk fans or some type of ceiling fan coupled with kind of extending the temperature set points of your HVAC system is one thing that could be really interesting to try out during this time period, because I think, to your point, Kelly, we've long known that individual control, whether it be temperature, airspeed, ventilation, empowering people, makes them more comfortable. And if that can be done at a reasonable cost with kind of a personal desk fan and coupled with the idea of extending the set point ranges, you could actually have a win-win from an energy standpoint.
Michael, I'd like to add a desk heater too, not just a fan.
True enough. There are a couple actually, there's desk heaters that potentially use a decent amount of energy. I know the Rocky Mountain Institute has some heated chairs, and actually cooled chairs, but you actually plug them in, the rechargeable. They have a little fan in the back for cooling, and they have a little electric heater similar to like a car heater for actually heating up, which is interesting. A little bit on the expensive side, but a really cool individual control idea for being able to kind of just lower the overall house system.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that we've found with raising up the outside air to a minimum of 50%, and in some cases even higher than that, is that we're getting a lot of calls with people that are complaining, but they're not hot or cold. And then what you find out is it's just the humidity that's making them feel uncomfortable. So normally with a minimum amount of outside air, the systems would normally dehumidify it when they cool it. But we're finding that since that's not the case, and this is going to, as we get into the summer months and get into July, this is going to be become much more critical. But it's not necessarily that people are hot or cold. It's just that they're uncomfortable because of the humidity.
Interesting. Michael, I'm super interested in those chairs that you mentioned. I wonder, because I know there's quite a few people who have the heaters under a table, and it can be quite a nightmare for some building engineers to deal with some of those things.
Yeah, especially given kind of the plug load of a building, and if you can charge them overnight when you don't have an electrical load on the building, and not just overall increase the load. But sorry to cut you off there.
No, I guess that's kind of what I was thinking. I'm wondering if they might be a little bit more expensive up front, but essentially they might save energy or save costs in the long run because of that rechargeable aspect to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that is kind of like the micro idea or version of, if we all had electric cars and could charge those during the day when solar energy was kind of at its peak, how do you have enough batteries in buildings to kind of get to that next level of being grid friendly? I think the chairs are probably way too small of a micro scale to be able to do that, but interesting and along those lines for sure.
Yeah. All right. Dan, I want to come back to you a little bit. We've talked a fair amount about technology and equipment in buildings. I know that CBRE has done quite a bit during this time period to train a lot of your staff. I'm wondering if you can talk to that a little bit.
Sure. One thing that we did find, which was tough early on, was that a lot of our clients are essential. So we couldn't just shut buildings down. So we still had to staff them. So what we did was we split into 2 shifts. We split the engineering teams in most buildings into 2, so that we would do a week on and a week off. And the week off, the engineers would work from home. So this typically isn't a job where there's a lot of work for them to do at home. So it was very challenging to come up with things for them to do and to be productive. And a lot of that was training. CBRE and a lot of the other companies have a tremendous amount of training available, and we utilize that time for the employees to advance their knowledge of building systems, but also to take a closer look at the building systems that we currently have, to look at the building automation system, which they normally would wait for an alarm because they would be out doing something else to tell them that something was amiss. But taking a deep dive into that daily and looking at each VAB, looking at each point, make sure everything was working correctly, that every valve was where it was supposed to be. And so with that, we found a lot of fans that were off that were supposed to be on, or things that weren't working properly. So we were able to really fine tune a lot of the buildings too, to make sure that they were almost in a commissioning in a way, to get them working like they were supposed to be. And then of course, ASHRAE came out with its guidelines for working in environments post-COVID, and then also where someone has been diagnosed recently as well. So we've been training them a lot on, instead of just changing out filters like we would normally do, taking precautions when they're doing that, disinfecting surfaces, things like that. So things that are a lot different from their traditional jobs it's the new job.
Yeah, I think that's definitely some of the stuff that we've seen even before COVID around kind of the training, and I think the opportunities that you were talking about there of just walking through the building and finding things is something that a lot of particularly smaller buildings don't necessarily do. And if you can do those regular walkthroughs of building, whether it's like monthly or quarterly, you're always going to find those little things that aren't quite working like you thought they were.
Right.
And try and make those changes. And ultimately, it's going to lead to your building being more efficient. Kelly, I'm going to come back to you and kind of get into looking forward a little bit more, and see if you think there's a new or different approach to workplace and real estate strategy that didn't really seem viable before this pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's actually really fascinating, because a lot of the things that people were trying ahead of time, like remote working or more virtual teams, teams spread out around the country, just accelerated the minute we all got sent home. And it's kind of like Dan was saying about how suddenly people are willing to put in touchless faucets. People are now willing to try remote work. And in talking to a couple of our clients over the past couple of months, some of them are actually really rethinking their overall workplace and real estate strategy as a network of systems and a network of locations. And it's not just, we have a headquarters that's the heart and brain of our organization, and everybody has to work here every day. which is a lot of traffic, a lot of energy use, all that stuff happening in one location, they're actually starting to think, you know what, maybe we can have some of our people just work remotely and they can stay home and that's okay. Maybe they come in a couple of days a week for more of the social interactions and some of the informal collaboration that they need to have. But you know what, you can mostly work at home. So your real estate portfolio starts to be redefined. It's, yes, headquarters, maybe it's smaller, but it's the heart and brain there. Maybe it's your kitchen table and my dining room and a little networked co-working hub that we brand as part of our organization that's off and a part that's easier for people to get to. So that system starts to expand in a pretty interesting way. And what is also good about that is that those places where people are coming together can be focused more on social and collaborative work, which frankly is potentially cheaper because you're not necessarily using acres of workstations to accommodate individuals at work, and it's potentially less wasteful because the social spaces aren't as maybe they're a little bit more energy use intensive, but their material use is less and the furniture use is less, and I think they can last longer and be more flexible over time. So that's an intriguing part of it. It just so happens I was reading the PBSJ right before we got on this call today, and King County moved a whole bunch of people out of their, what was it, the Jackson Street Center, and what they're doing exactly what I was suggesting here, which is not only is everybody working from home, they're talking about consolidating people into some of their newer buildings, and they're using the Federal Way Aquatic Center and meeting rooms at the sewage treatment plants and other facilities that they have as part of their network already, and even picnic shelters to start hosting meetings right now. And so I love the way that they're kind of embracing this moment to say, how can we really think about not work as a place, but something that we do? And wouldn't it be way more fun to have a meeting in a picnic shelter anyway? So I think it's a perfect example of somebody sort of leaping onto this moment and doing something big with it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think particularly as summer starts to come, there's a great opportunity to start using some of those outdoor areas for those meetings. You don't necessarily have to go to an outdoor coffee shop for it.
Right.
You can just show up. I also really like the idea of still having that office space to go to if you need it, but working from home. I did hear an interesting thing. I think my wife showed me this on Twitter. It was like it's become less work from home and living where you work at the moment. So I'm looking forward to that kind of opportunity where there are spaces to go where you can kind of at least differentiate the two a little bit.
Right.
So Michael, I'm going to come to you for the last question here, kind of related to what Kelly was talking about there. Are there strategies that you're seeing that developers and building owners should be considering for new construction projects?
Yeah, I think that there definitely are, and there's plenty of documentation about, things in the HVAC world, such as filtration and humidity levels, for human health, and interestingly, things that potentially are cost adds to a project. And what I really loved about what you just said, Kelly, was this idea that if we can redefine the workplace to be more about social gathering and incorporate, things that can focus on things that can drive energy use down, because social gathering spaces inherently actually, have a lot less plug load. They might have more lighting load, but people aren't doing heavy computing in those spaces. So I feel like if we start to shift in that direction, our buildings inherently have the ability to get closer to this, net zero energy place that we want to, and we can shift the investment dollars in our real estate from, to the things that the passive strategies that can help get us there, right? Social spaces lend themselves a little bit more to natural ventilation types of strategies, focusing on daylighting and shading, and then, taking the maybe the less expensive, more simplistic approach to an HVAC system, and kind of making sure that you are putting the money where it matters most. And so I think that's a super interesting, I hope that plays out, because I think I totally agree with that. The pieces that I love about being in the office are the human interaction piece and the social piece. We're all finding right now that, does it really matter if you're sitting at a desk at home or in the office? If you're on a meeting like this or a gathering like this, it shouldn't matter where, what seat your butt is in. And so, yeah, being able to get after those passive strategies, so that you then, if you have smaller HVAC systems, can also focus on implementing some of those human health aspects into it, right? You can afford then a humidification system or a better filtration system, or an outdoor air delivery system that delivers more than code minimum, if you can downsize it, compared to your traditional metrics in the industry of what a traditional office building or mixed use building looks like. So I think a lot of interesting things lie ahead as we figure out what the workplace of the future is going to look like.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
All right. We have come to that point. We have about 10 minutes left. So I do want to give anyone in the audience online an opportunity to ask a question. So feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand, or chances are you can just unmute yourself and go for it, and you probably won't come across any problems. And if we don't have any questions, I think I'd probably like to build on Michael's last point there, and see if Kelly, you're seeing any of these things play out, or if it's a little bit too early in the game to see if clients are starting to think about this redesign in new projects.
I think it's a little early. We were working with a retailer on the East Coast, and their lease is not up for 5 years. So they're they're thinking about this, and they're thinking that they might consider it as one of their possible scenarios. I think other clients are far enough along in their design and construction process that they will probably leave the design as it is, but may use the space very, very differently. So maybe more of the shared seating model, more of the flexible work choice, and maybe use the building to just eventually host more capacity, as opposed to sort of ripping out a design plan. So for me, it's kind of a hypothesis, and I'm hoping that somebody's going to take us up on it pretty soon, because I do think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting on our end. We're obviously different aspects of the building, but we're starting to see some of our customers at least ask the question for projects that are still in design. Tell me more about, is it easy or difficult or within our budget to do X, Y, or Z, based on whatever they're thinking. Increased ventilation, increased filtration, UV or ionization strategies, kind of some of the technology and sensor packs that I was mentioning. So they're not necessarily jumping in with both feet on totally changing, but we're definitely starting to hear a lot more, tell me more, tell me what it would take to incorporate some of these ideas into our buildings, and then, making a similar business case like most owners do on weighing the risks and the benefits for doing those types of things. So we're at least starting to see a little bit of movement there, which is good.
Nice. Dan, are you starting to see any of these things come to light in your building in terms of redesign of any of the tenant spaces?
The tenant spaces, not so much, but just internally, absolutely. I mean, we had to redesign our engineering shops for coming back to work. Normally people sit closer than 6 feet between each other, so we had to, in some cases, take a shop and split it in half and find 2 places to have the staff sit. We've also run into when you have a guy on a ladder and he's up there and somebody else is holding the ladder to make sure it's stable, or you have 2 people working on a project where 2 people are required to be on that project. How do you social distance in cases like that? So a lot of just the internal things that we've been doing have been changes to make things more safe in that environment.
Great. So I'm going to assume that we've answered every question because we haven't got anything in the chat, and it's not that we just have a very shy audience. So I want to take this opportunity to thank all 3 of you again for being part of this panel. Again, it was recorded today, so look out for the recording. If you want to send it out to others, please feel free to do so. Our next session is going to be the 4th Tuesday of July, and we're really going to be concentrating on the commute side of things and how your commute is going to be impacted by some of this and what your options are to hopefully reduce the amount of people who are going to drive alone to work, which is the high possibility of what's going to happen and what we want to try and avoid. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that. And we will see you at the end of July. Have a great 4th of July weekend. Hopefully the sun comes out, even though you won't be able to spend it with a lot of other people. Watch some fireworks on TV. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.